Good morning, Seth. Good morning, Michael. So today's panel, we are essentially building on a previous event that we held last month on terrorism in the time of coronavirus. What we're doing now is we're going to be focusing specifically on the Islamic State in the time of coronavirus. So a bit more specific, just to give an overview before we start. I'm sure most of you know this, but so COVID-19, the coronavirus, we've seen so far over 3.5 million reported cases of people infected with the virus. We've seen worldwide struggling economy, social discontent, an increase in gender violence. We've seen the possibility for long-term effects on mental health issues. But what about terrorism in the time of coronavirus? And more specifically, like I said, ISIS in the time of coronavirus. So just very briefly, and then I will let our speakers take it away. In 2017, we saw the end of the Islamic State's so-called or self-proclaimed Caliphate in Iraq. And then 2 years later, in March 2019, we saw the Syrian Democratic Forces regain the area in Syria called Magoo, and that was the end of the Islamic State Caliphate in Syria. However, since then, pockets of sleeper cells and ISIS supporters have remained in both countries and across the globe. So this week and over the past couple of months specifically, we've seen an increase in the number of attacks and also the gravity of attacks by the Islamic State. For example, in Iraq, just this Saturday, 10 members of the popular mobilization units, or the Hashd-e-Shabi in Iraq, were killed in an ISIS attack. Last month in Kirkuk, the Islamic State, they claimed responsibility for an attack in the city of Kirkuk in Iraq. Also in April, a military convoy was attacked by ISIS in the Philippines. So we've seen this across the globe. In addition to COVID-19, right now it's also Ramadan, a month in which ISIS is known to increase its attacks, but obviously I'm sure the speakers will mention this. So our very small but great panel today, Seth and Michael, I'll let them take it from here. Just a very brief introduction of them both, and then I'll let them introduce themselves. Michael Krona is an assistant professor and senior researcher at Malmö University in Sweden. He's worked on Islamic State media and propaganda since 2014 and is the co-editor and author of The Media World of ISIS. Seth Frantzman, he's the author of a recent book called After ISIS. He's also the executive director of the Middle East Center for Reporting and Analysis, and he covers the Middle East for the Jerusalem Post. So Michael, if you'd like to start off.
Yeah, thank you. I hope everybody can hear me. And if not, I hope there are technical assistance by the organizers. First of all, thank you for inviting me to speak here at this event. Thank you to the organizers, Mitchell in particular. As Sophia mentioned, I'm a researcher and academic scholar in media and communication studies, which means that I have tracked and monitored Islamic State on the media platforms rather than concerning religious or geopolitical aspects. So my brief talk here today will be about how the Islamic State currently is trying to convey or generate various discourses of opportunity concerning the coronavirus outbreak. And I think one thing that is important to remember as a pretext is that whenever there has been uncertain times or there has been countries and governments in which there has been a political turmoil, Islamic State has always tried to sort of seek the opportunity to present themselves as a viable option or an alternative. And I think, especially in these times, actually, that we are experiencing on a global scale a form of uncertainty. I think there is an opportunity inherent in the ideology of Islamic State to try to exploit it. And this is what they're doing currently. And for someone like me who has been following them for now, 6 years, I think, online, I see in the last 3-4 months a definite increase and sophistication of strategies to actually convey this discourse of opportunity concerning the pandemic. So I would just like to briefly mention a few examples of this. It is my take on Islamic State media and their supporters that there is always then, or has always been in the history of the Islamic State, an interplay between official leadership and official media outlets conveying a certain type of messaging, and the supporter networks, which are decentralized but very, very active. And this interplay between official media and supporter-driven media has always been sort of very, very important for the Islamic State. And just like we have seen when we have had high-profile attacks around the world, not least in Europe perhaps, we have always seen how the Islamic State has created and designed a very strategic media campaign following that attack, just to highlight or sort of increase the exposure of it and to highlight the brand of the Islamic State. And I think we see similar strategies currently when there is an ongoing event around the world that a lot of people are focused on, a lot of governments are focused on. This is something that they try to now exploit in terms of increasing their media activity. And we have seen how official media outlets of the Islamic State has mentioned or referred to this pandemic as God's torment, or sort of the punishment of God on the infidels. So they have made, from an official point of view, they have made quite clear religious or theological explanations to the virus. And when you combine that with different type of health guidelines that they have published for their supporters and for Muslims in general, combined with a lot of chatter online by supporters just reinforcing and amplifying this message, it has become quite a strong narrative, I would say, in the Islamic State circuits. And this interlink between supporter-driven media and official media outlets, it's an interlink that is unsurpassed, I would say, if we compare it to other organizations and how rivalry groups are using the media platforms available and different type of strategies to communicate a certain message. Islamic State has not only the human resources to maintain a stable, active online presence, but also the skill to do it, and literacy, the media literacy to actually implement certain type of strategies. So this is something that we need to remember, and I don't want to sound as if I celebrate the skills of the Islamic State, but it's something that it's important to recognize that they have not least human and technological resources to maintain these information campaigns and messaging online. And that has been really, really important during the pandemic. They have always tried to exploit certain vacuums, information vacuums. So in the last 3 or 4 months, a lot of the world's media attention has been focused on the pandemic rather than global terrorism or Islamic State as an organization. And I think one of the dangers or challenges that we have now is that there is a tendency sometimes that when there are certain events deviating from focus on specific terrorist organizations, we tend to forget that and move into other areas. Just like the example of when bin Laden was killed, we sort of took our eyes off Al-Qaeda after 2011, and 3 years later, the Islamic State sort of came through as a result of the Iraqi branch in Al-Qaeda's Iraqi branch. And I think it's important that we keep our eyes on the Islamic State, even if they are sort of not on the international media news radar at the current time, because they are really trying to exploit this situation. They are mobilizing, and that can be seen by observing their online operations, not least. And the different ways that they try to create and convey this discourse of opportunity, it comes in different forms, but it comes through what I mentioned, official statements, using a certain type of language, try to explain it, not least with theological background. And then you have chatter online, and you have very active supporters who are in their own platforms and channels, not only amplifying the official messaging, but also create their own discourses. And they inspire each other, for instance, to attack, just like they have in the last few years, to attack in Western nations, especially now that a lot of governments in Western nations are being focused on dealing with the pandemic. That means that they are fragile. That means that there are suitable targets. They have mentioned, supporters are mentioning so-called soft targets to strike against civilians. Hospitals, I think, is the one that is most reoccurrent in the forums that I monitor. Hospitals being one of the institutions that actually has a physical crowd of people. So there is this high activity in this relationship between official media statements and the chatter online among supporters. Now that's not new at all, but it's really important currently when, as I said, the international media focus maybe is on something else. I have also seen an uptick in terms of information and donation campaigns when it comes to the detention camps and prisons in, not least in northern Syria. You see information campaigns that are being argued as appealing to supporters to help free women and children from these camps, because governments are now failing to provide the most basic care. So Islamic State supporters are sort of offering or arguing for themselves to be more caring about the Muslim array of campaigns to donate money and to raise money to help free women and children in these camps as well. And overall, I think this is the Islamic State, both official and supporters, are really tapping into their core ideological messaging and their apocalyptic narrative of this virus, the doomsday or the end of days and narrative that they sort of requires them to participate in this perpetual war. This has also been adjusted. This narrative is being used a lot about the virus. There is, for instance, on certain platforms where supporters are very active online, you see the creation of channels and groups that are designated only to discuss the coronavirus. I call them just Corona channels, because that's what they are talking about. And there are certain channels where they discuss how various Arab states in the Middle East are failing to battle this virus. And again, they try to generate this discourse of the Islamic State being a more viable option. And then there is this, on a local and regional level, there is this important geopolitical aspect as well, where countries now, if we take Iraq as an example, where you have a rise in unemployment due to failing oil prices, etc. And this rise in unemployment is also an opportunity to gain local support on the ground for the Islamic State. So there are many factors here, and this combination of online activities with offline activities, I think is really, really important. So the Islamic State is currently exploiting this situation by legitimizing both politically, religiously, and to present themselves as this viable option and an organization that especially takes care of Muslim populations more than failing governments do. And there are a number of online strategies and activities that are taking place currently. And I think this is just a frame of how I approach this topic, and I would be happy to take questions later on that are maybe more in detail about the media messaging. So by that, I would just like to say thank you, and I look forward to an interesting discussion.
Great. Michael, thank you very much. All right, let's go on to Seth in Jerusalem.
Hi, thank you for having me today. The last time that I saw members of Islamic State was in September last year, when I went up to the mountains next to Malmö in northern Iraq. The area is a kind of border area between the Kurdish autonomous region's Peshmerga forces and an area that ostensibly is supposed to be controlled by the Iraqi army, Iraqi security forces, and paramilitary units related to them, such as the Hashd al-Shabi or the PMU units. And we stood on top of a mountain called Mount Karachok, and we looked into the distance in this area that is kind of a dividing area, and we could see what the officer there said were members of ISIS coming out of a cave to get water and then go back into the cave. And that was in September. And in March of this year, March 9th, I think, 2 US soldiers who are members of the coalition that is fighting ISIS were killed in a raid very close to there, trying to root out several of this ISIS cells that are there. And I think that gives us a kind of good picture of not only what ISIS is today. I spent a lot of time in the last 5 years on the ground in battles against ISIS in places like Mosul, when ISIS was a much more powerful, sophisticated organization in terms of the fact that it held ground as a conventional, basically, terror army, which is that it had tunnels, it had armored explosive vehicles. Today, ISIS, I think, if we looked at the attacks that were just mentioned, its resurgence is interesting because it's able to coordinate now larger scale attacks using dozens of men with night vision, with weapons, again, unstable region, I think, that is a primarily Sunni Arab region. So ISIS has certainly increased its attacks. I think in April, the number of attacks it claimed were around 150 across Syria and Iraq, which is about double of what it used to claim. It certainly is on the upswing, I think, in terms of what it's trying to do. But I think we need to understand, at least in my perspective, which is, I think, different than looking at the social media or kind of some of the other perspectives, but kind of on the ground, what was happening is, especially in Iraq, which I think Iraq is very important because Iraq is in some ways the heartland of where ISIS grew out of. It's where it had a lot of supporters. It enabled ISIS then to go into Syria and exploit the Syrian conflict and take over parts of Syria, and then of course become this massive global phenomenon in which, you know, ISIS was able to sponge up support from groups that had previously supported other groups, extremist groups, like groups that had been connected to Al-Qaeda or what have you, whether it's in Sinai or across Africa, down to Mozambique, all the way to Asia, which were not affiliates, I think we could say, or ISIS inspired. So if we look at Iraq, which is a bit of this heartland, or at least it's a good bellwether for some of what's happening, let's remember what happened in Iraq in the last 6 months. Last year, there were massive protests in Iraq. Someone has already mentioned the declining oil prices. Also, you had the rising US-Iran tensions, which means that the US-led coalition, and let's remember that the coalition that is fighting ISIS, even though it's like 70 partner countries, it's primarily, in terms of its killing power, is primarily the United States, France, and the UK. The United States was involved in airstrikes against pro-Iranian militias and the Iranian IRGC. And the Iranian IRGC, or these militias, were involved in rocket attacks against bases where US soldiers are. I think there were about 20 of those rocket attacks in which 4 members of the coalition were killed. the Iran-US tensions came at the worst time, in the sense that the virus, the pandemic, also exploded in Iraq in February and March. Although the number of official cases in Iraq is not that many, but the fear of the virus exploded in that sense. So you suddenly had in Iraq, with protests, low oil prices, the pandemic, and the US-Iran tensions. And the US-Iran tensions forced the US, or caused the US, to reposition its forces from 6 different bases in which the US basically withdrew, also the French. And not only that, but around, I think, 5 or 6 European countries also withdrew forces from Iraq in the last months. So you have suddenly a situation in which there's a kind of vacuum of power. How can the Iraqi security forces, which were trained by the United States and the coalition over the last several years, how can the security forces not only keep a lid on ISIS, but also deal with the fact that the salaries are low, there's an economic disaster, there's massive protests. Iraq does not have a prime minister yet. It has a prime minister who resigned last year. And they've had 3 different people now trying to become prime minister, in which the recent one is trying to put together a cabinet. So you have a vacuum of power. You also have some of the key units that were involved in fighting ISIS, which are the Iranian-backed or PMU paramilitaries, which also include local tribal or ethnic units such as Shebeks, Christians, Sunni militias. Those units are also distracted by the US-Iran tensions. So I think the amazing thing to me is not just that there is an uptick in ISIS attacks, because of course ISIS would like to exploit this vacuum. Actually, I'm surprised the attacks are as low as they were, because if you were an ISIS member of an ISIS cell, I would have thought the attacks would have reached a crescendo last year, but they appear to be growing now. So I think that, you know, ISIS has suffered some setbacks, right? The leader of ISIS was also killed last year. They've had to rearrange some of their headquarters personnel. And ISIS, by the way, today does not have the ability to draw on the 50,000 supporters, fighting supporters that they drew on in 2014 and 2015 when they were kind of on the rise. So who is ISIS able to draw on in a place like Iraq or Syria? They have all this sleeper cells. They have, this communities in rural areas. As I mentioned, for instance, like if you go from the Kurdistan region over towards Nineveh, down to Baji or down to Kirkuk, all of these areas that were basically fought over or liberated, what have you, in 2017, which, by the way, many of them, like Hawija, were rolled over very quickly by the Iraqi security forces, in the sense that the forces took the towns. They never bothered to secure the mountain ranges or the rural environment. So in many cases, if you were an ISIS member, you could basically melt away into the cave structures or wadis or other rural areas. And those ISIS members, they are able to get support from the local population in many cases in rural areas, but they're not able to hold ground. And by the way, they're also not able to carry out the mass devastating attacks that they used to carry out, like, huge truck bombings in which dozens or hundreds are killed. So the ISIS attacks we've seen have been against checkpoints or using fake checkpoints. In some cases, they rack up a body count. For instance, this last attacks. But we saw the same thing, if I recall, back in 2018 and 2019. There were this kind of sudden resurgence, and then they would decline, especially because the Iraqi security forces would launch these constant wave of clearing operations. So I think, there's a big question mark over what kind of comes next. Do we see an increasing rise over the next month again and again? So we start to see what we saw in 2013, 2014, when ISIS, no one even cared or knew what ISIS was, but slowly but surely it was building its potential. And I think, so do we see next month, 300 attacks, 600 attacks? Do we see parts of Anbar province or Salahuddin or Diyala province start to kind of slip into anarchy? Or is the Iraqi security forces with the PMU able to keep a lid on this? And I think that would be a key question. We talked about Syria briefly, which I think is an interesting, important point. Turkish-backed groups and the SDF that kind of infiltrate. And, you know, there are something like 10 or 20,000 of this ISIS detainees, in which some of them are hardcore foreign fighters. The ability of the SDF to contain those people during the pandemic is a serious problem. And the international community, including the coalition, is providing only a small amount of aid, which I would say that eventually we've seen the riots in the prisons there. That's going to bubble over. So unless someone keeps an eye on it. I'm not an expert on North Africa or what's happening in some of those areas, but I would say that we obviously see a lot of uptick in violence in Lake Chad and other areas in Mozambique by groups that are either ISIS affiliates or parts of a kind of other networks like Al-Shabaab or other groups that form a kind of belt of insurgency, anarchy, jihadism, extremism that stretches across those areas. And I don't see how any of those countries can successfully defeat these groups, especially given the fact that most of the European countries, or France especially, have a difficult time focusing as much on the anti-terrorism struggle or the counterinsurgency struggle when they have to deal with the pandemic at home. So the pandemic certainly gives all of these groups an opportunity. And I guess we have to see then what happens over the next months. I do think, you know, it's very important to keep an eye on it because, you know, it's extraordinary the degree to which when ISIS burst onto the scene, remember in June 2014, when I think Mosul fell in about 24 hours, a huge city. So, you know, cities can fall or towns can fall very quickly to a group if the structure that is governing them is perceived to be very weak and the people are able to take advantage of that. You can see that. But, you know, groups like ISIS, it seems to me they also go through kind of a cycle of global popularity and then, what's the word, evening off, of plateauing a bit. So I would tend to think that you know, ISIS is ISIS, but there may be some other thing that comes along that even begins to soak up some of that. Just the way Al-Qaeda was considered very popular in the 90s, early 2000s, and then it kind of plateaued and started to not disappear, but obviously changed form a lot. So that would be, I guess that would be my feeling. But I think the main issue is that you look at Iraq and you just see this is an area where there is a wellspring of support. There's a lot of disenfranchised people in certain areas. There are not people that are going to join ISIS in southern Iraq, which is primarily Shiite, or in the Kurdistan region, but you have a belt of areas in which there is potential for support. And you have, as I said, at least 4 or 5 big reasons that would cause this country, which cause any country, to have a difficult time fighting a successful counterinsurgency strategy when you have to fight a pandemic, oil prices that have collapsed, in which 95% of your economy is based on them or something, in which security forces are divided, in which one security force is fighting an international coalition within your country. It's extraordinary that Iraq has even been able to keep things together up to this point.
Seth, thank you very much for that. So before we go on, I would just like to remind attendees and viewers to please pop their questions into the Q&A rather than the message chat. That makes it easier for me to sort of go through them. Thank you. So thank you very much, Seth. Thank you very much, Michael. Before we go on to viewer Q&As, I wanted to run a couple of questions by both of you, starting with Michael. So Michael, you mentioned that there has been an increase in online chatter throughout sort of ISIS supporter groups and whatnot. And also the UN Secretary General recently warned against extremist groups, including ISIS, taking advantage of the lockdown, of people being online more than usual as a way of recruiting or supporters or spreading hatred or whatnot. My question to you is, yes, there's been an increase in this online, but does that also give intelligence, and does that also give governments the ability to monitor these people more because it's online rather than in real life?
Yeah, it's a valid question. I would say I wish there was a simple answer to it, but the fact is that my experience is that around, I think it was October, November last year, there was a big takedown measure from Telegram, where basically almost all the accounts connected to Islamic State were deleted. And from November, December last year up until today, what has happened is that the chatter and the number of platforms that are being used has increased to a level of, I think there are studies now showing that ISIS or ISIS supporters are experimenting on about 200 different type of media platforms. So that has created a difficulty for intelligence community to monitor them, I would say. It was a bit easier before because they were very centralized and focused on one or fewer platforms. Having said that, I think the fact that currently in this situation where a lot of people are more or less obliged to stay at home, that increases the use of extremist material online, not just by supporters, but also people like myself who try to understand it. So we shouldn't really be fooled by numbers saying that the increased consumption of extremist material just has skyrocketed. It's not just extremists, it's also people like myself. So having supporters of Islamic State and other groups are spending more time online, they are consuming this material, and this is something that these organizations, their central media departments and other supporters are fully aware of. That is a problem, of course, and it is a problem for the intelligence community. Whether your question on if that could be a possibility to actually monitor them stronger, I assume so, but I also know that a lot of intelligence services, at least those some in Europe that I've been in touch with, have difficulties because of the decentralized structure of how Islamic State supporters are currently communicating on encrypted platforms, and these platforms where they can choose the encryption level to a large extent by themselves. It has made it more difficult. So the answer is a bit double-edged. There are two sides, of course, but as an academic, we're used to not giving straight answers always, but it's a complex matter.
Yeah. And is there, I mean, based on what you've seen over the past few months, are there specific areas or countries where this uptick has come from, or is it sort of across the board?
It is across the board. The good thing or bad thing, depending on how we see it, about media technology is that nation doesn't really matter. It travels over nation borders. So I think it's more important to look at languages in it, because there are a number of sort of national outlets of channels where you have supporters who have groups in, if it is Swedish or French or German or Arabic, it changes. And there are a number of languages in these channels that I mean, anyone can basically find community in the Islamic State virtual world, because there is this strong, broad approach to it in terms of languages, and can also be ethnic communities or something. So it's hard to say where the uptick is. Of course, Arabic channels are very always like dominant. There are a lot of English speaking channels as well, but it's hard to say more specific than that, to be honest.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. Seth, I wanted to go to you briefly, and before we open up to the viewers, let's go back quickly to, you mentioned being near Mahmour and the presence of ISIS sleeper cells in the mountain range near Mahmour. I was wondering if, when it comes to areas like the redisputed territories forever between Baghdad and the Kurdistan Regional Government, has this also been a factor in allowing the Islamic State to, or at least their sleeper cells, to sort of thrive in these areas?
Yeah, I think we need to understand a bit of what goes on there. So, for instance, as you noted, there's areas there like Kirkuk, governor of province, which was disputed between the Kurdistan region and Baghdad, and there was supposed to be a decade ago a referendum and all of that. And of course, as many people recall, in 2014, when ISIS attacked, and ISIS was heading for Kirkuk and Erbil, the Iraqi security forces melted away, and it was the Kurdish Peshmerga forces, supported with the coalition, that were able to then secure parts around Kirkuk. And that lasted until 2017, after the referendum, when the central government, with backing from the PMU and I think tacit backing from the coalition, retook Kirkuk, and there were brief clashes. Now, I think that those clashes left lasting anger, certainly among the Peshmerga and Kurdish forces who suffered casualties, and also because of the kind of nationalist extremist rhetoric we saw in Baghdad by some of the pro-Iranian units that were very, very openly anti-Kurdish. That I think, you know, there was a kind of break in which, if you looked at that dividing line, there was very little interest on each side for helping the other side. Now, by the time I got there in September 2019, there was Security Forces Assistance Brigade, or SFABs, which were part of the coalition. And the coalition's concept was, well, okay, the Kurdish guys over here don't really talk to or get along with the guys on that side. And between them, we have a bunch of ISIS guys hang out in caves. Well, how do you deal with that? Well, what you do is you send, you know, some US coalition forces to Nineveh, and you have some coalition forces embedded with the Kurdish guys in Mahmur. And of course, the coalition guys talk to each other, even if the guys on the ground don't want to talk to each other much. That was supposed to lead to coordination. When I was there, it wasn't clear to me how the local commander, or the colonel or whatever, could communicate with his counterpart a few kilometers away. How he had to talk to the coalition to communicate with the other guy. That's not a very good way to run a war. So obviously, if you're ISIS, and ISIS is not stupid, ISIS is very, very sophisticated. ISIS knows the landscape there better than the forces deployed to fight them, because the ISIS guys, many of them are from some of those areas, or at least they have contacts there. So this is something that they know like the back of their hand, whereas the PMU or some of the Iraqi security forces guys are not from there. They're from Basra or some other place. How do you expect that the guys from Basra who are asked to man some checkpoint are going to ferret these guys out in a cave somewhere? And anyway, from the other side of the coin, the Kurdish Peshmerga guys, why do they want to suffer casualties hunting down around in some caves that, in their view, well, this is not part of the Kurdistan Autonomous Region, so we're just securing our side. You Iraqi should secure your side. That's a recipe for the fact that you're going to have people that are able to thrive in this area. But how many ISIS members can actually thrive in these kind of rural areas? Tens of thousands in the Hamreen Mountains? No, the sleeper cells are quite small. So I think that, you know, these ISIS people are able to go back to these haunts or areas that they thrived in over the last decades. Remember, many of the ISIS guys came out of the insurgency of 2005, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Some of these guys have been fighting in places like Hawija for years, and they've seen they've seen rises and falls. They kind of know the ground very well. I mean, they may be a terrorist group, but how are they different than the Viet Cong or something that fought for decades against the French and the Americans? I mean, they know the landscape, and the history of fighting people that know the landscape, it makes it very difficult. I interviewed one or two ISIS detainees who were caught after the battles of 2017. And one of them was a 19-year-old kid, or I guess he was 18, 19 at the time. And he basically said, you know, when I'm allowed to leave here, I'll go back to Hammam al-Leo, and I'm going to fight the Iranians. And by the Iranians, he meant the PMU and Kateb Hezbollah and all of this PMU groups. So who was going to change his mind? I mean, I wasn't, and the people that were detaining him were not going to change his mind. He was eventually intending to go back there. So I just get a sense of that's just a fact of life. I don't know what the recipe is that a place like Iraq could defeat this. And Iraq, as I said before, is such a weak country today and so divided. Even if it was like a powerful country, like a France or a Germany, it would have difficulty defeating networks like this, I would think.
So, Seth, how far is what's happening now, is this uptick a result of this pandemic that we're seeing, and how far was it expected? I mean, would the uptick that we've seen over the past couple of months in Iraq specifically have happened regardless of whether COVID-19 had happened?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because if we go back 2.5 years to when Mosul was still the end of the Battle of Mosul, Mosul was a huge city, I think around 2 million people when it was conquered by ISIS. But you know, when the actual battle for Mosul unfolded, which took around 9 months, there were only estimated like 5,000 ISIS fighters in Mosul. And a lot of them, or some of them, were hardcore foreigners like Chechens and other people. So that's only a few thousand people out of what is a population of hundreds of thousands. ISIS was not successfully able to put together a conventional force of 100,000 local fighters in Iraq. They actually only successfully mobilized tens of thousands of Iraqis and 50,000 foreigners who actually made up the worst of their shock troops. So I don't know. I would think that 2 years after the Battle of Mosul, or 2.5 years, brings us to basically December. So they were able to rekindle the networks, and they've watched the coalition air power and things reduce the airstrikes, and they've watched the PMU become lazy at the checkpoints and become corrupt. So, you know, they're able to feed off that, but I think this was inevitable, but I don't see them having a massive support. Would not yet, at least, because they don't have the foreigners. A lot of them were dead. A lot of their serious operators who were ISIS members who had military training from the years of Saddam or had expertise. I mean, we have to remember back in the day, ISIS it innovated with drones. It was making its own mortars. You know, they're a very sophisticated organization. I don't see the sophistication today. I see the raids that the Iraqis do nowadays, and when they find what the ISIS guys have in the caves, they find rusted mortars, they find some thermals that the ISIS have stolen, some M16s. It doesn't seem that sophisticated. And as I noted before, ISIS has not carried out large-scale bombing campaigns recently in Iraq or Syria, and it has not carried out any prison breaks. If anyone recalls the old days of like the breaking the walls campaign or whatever, they haven't been able to put that together. So I think that this was inevitable. I think that it represents an upswing. But each time that ISIS has tried to rekindle things over the last 2 years, it has not been successful, it seems, yet in mobilizing a lot of local chaos and instability that would thrive off of. So, for instance, we don't see massive protests in Tikrit or Ramadi or Mosul or the cities that I think would be probably key for them. And we also see that there is motivation by Sunni tribal fighters and tribes to fight ISIS. The problem is that the tribes were starved of some of their support and guns and money. So that's not particularly helpful if you actually starve those people that actually want to fight ISIS and they don't even have the correct weapons to go fight them.
All right, Seth, thank you very much. So we're going to go on to Q&As now. We're going to open up to our viewers. I've seen a few messages. Some of them are worried that we're not going to get to them. Do not worry. We're opening up to you guys now. So, first question is for Michael, and it's from Adam Hoffman. His question is, are the Islamic State's messaging campaigns on the pandemic planned or opportunistic? So is ISIS setting objectives, talking points, key areas to focus on, or are they mainly responding to existing events and discussions in Western media?
Not just responding to Western media, they're also responding to a development that changes from day to day. So I would say that they're more opportunistic than they are planned, but it's also, we have to keep track of of the history here. So whenever there has been a certain type of events that changes the pretext for the Islamic State, they have always managed to find some form of solution to it. They are extremely adjustable, they are flexible and sophisticated in trying to take an event and control the narrative of the event and to create an opportunity from it, whatever the event may be. So they have a very planned structure, but the day-to-day conversations and the day-to-day messaging, I would say, is more opportunistic. It depends on their responding to what is happening, but it's not improvised. They know what they are doing. That would be my answer.
Thank you. We have a question regarding funding. Seth, if you'd like to take this on. Marcela Szymanski asks, can you comment on the funding sources that ISIS has now in times of crisis, and specifically with oil not really bringing them what it used to bring them?
Well, I would apologize. I've never been an expert in the funding issue, and I would say that, on the obvious fact is that certainly with the pandemic and borders being closed and oil being basically zero, and Turkey having built a wall, and certainly the funding sources having dried up a bit over the years, it does seem that while ISIS is able to smuggle people and things sometimes, even to the extent that they got them through Turkey to Idlib or things like that, which were kind of extraordinary, I don't think it doesn't look like ISIS is a well-financed campaign anymore, just by judging from the fact of what we see when we see the raids and what they actually have in their caves. I mean, the evidence is that ISIS guys are getting food and things from local people or something, but it doesn't seem that they have so much that's sophisticated. So it would appear from the evidence that there isn't much funding flowing in. And certainly, as you noted, not like back in the day when ISIS was basically a state. I mean, ISIS, it was running a real country. It was getting all sorts of ransom payments. It was exporting oil. It was doing all the things that a kind of country would ostensibly do, although in a very bad way. But I don't see the evidence that it has a sophisticated structure. And if the reality is, if there's sleeper cells, I can't see how they can run the bank accounts and all this stuff that would have existed in their infrastructure prior to. But as I said, I'm not an expert really in how the money gets necessarily from point A to point B. When I was in Iraq, I did go into places that were ISIS bomb-making factories, and we were able to see some of the fertilizers and stuff that they used, and we were able to photograph, for instance, when it was purchased and track that back, usually to just sometimes to Turkey or other sources, which was interesting to see the degree to which like that, up until the period where they were totally under siege, and you were asking, well, yeah, but how does all the stuff get through? So obviously they are very smart, but I don't know how. I would assume that the funding has been vastly decreased.
Yeah. Before we go forward, if none of the questions are specific to either one of you, but you want to jump in, please just unmute and feel free to jump in. So the next question is by Mitchell Belfer, and he's asking, how is the Islamic State's success during COVID-19 crisis impacting other groups like Al-Qaeda and the competition between them? I would ask Michael if you want to respond to this. Seth, also, if you want to jump in, again, please.
Yeah, so it's hard to measure the type of success or which group has been more successful. If we look at the relationship between, I think in particular, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban movement, there have been a different type of approach to it. Al-Qaeda has been more sort of interested in trying to portray themselves as this regional or local taking care of the population better, sort of an option for a vulnerable population. When ISIS do that, has done that as well, but they also have this global movement thing going on, that Al-Qaeda and the Taliban doesn't. So there is a different way of approaching, also trying to gain from the situation in terms of how they communicate, what type of propaganda and messaging they want to put forward. But I would say, like always, the Islamic State media operations, whatever the case has been around, has always, or at least during the last 7 or 8 years, has been the bar to which other rivalry groups are trying to reach. They try to mimic the Islamic State, and I think in this case as well, the Islamic State and how they have dealt with the pandemic will be it will be a reference point for other groups to try to adapt to. But they had different goals and they have different means, but it's still an important reference point, I would say.
Thank you, Michael. Our next question is by Ilya Belosniemi, and she's asking about, her question is about gender aspects of within terrorism. Could you please elaborate a little bit more on the rhetoric regarding women and children in northwest Syria being exploited by ISIS? And have we seen concrete implications of this? Seth, I think one is whether there has been exploitation by the state, and particularly over the past couple of months. Now, she's mentioning northwest Syria. I'd be more inclined to look at northeast and the women in Islamic State, under where Islamic State prisoners are being held. But if you could give us your view on whether women are being, in fact, exploited by remnants of the Islamic State in Syria.
Well, I would say that one of the problems in the way that the Syrian campaign was conducted by the coalition and to some extent the SDF was that when ISIS was defeated in Magoo, as everyone may recall, Magoo was a very small area, but somehow there were like tens of thousands of people there, many of whom were ISIS supporting families. And ISIS made a conscious decision not to sacrifice them, but actually to surrender in totality. So you have tens of thousands of ISIS supporters and their families. The families ended up in Al-Hol camp and some other camps. And what we saw was that because the SDF and the international community didn't have the resources to deal with this processing, there was most cases where it seemed to me that the hardcore ISIS supporters, including, by the way, women, we should remember, are not innocent in this, in the sense that there were many hardcore ISIS supporters who were not only women, but in fact, in some cases, like in Albania or Kosovo's, women played a key role in recruitment of men, not the other way around. So women play a key role in enforcement as well. And in our whole camp, what I understand was that the women areas of the mostly hardcore, especially foreign supporters, is that the women recreated a kind of enforcement ISIS mini-state. So, and the SDF always said, listen, it's our job to contain this, but it's not our job to deal with each individual people. We can't de-radicalize them. And the international community said, okay, but we're not going to take them back. So that just left tens of thousands of people in limbo. And obviously those people are not only being exploited in a sense, or maybe they themselves are exploiters, but there's evidence that these people still have some Yazidis that were kidnapped. There's evidence, obviously, that they use cell phones and other means to communicate back and forth. They actually are evidence that they are killing each other. For instance, they are enforcing the harsh ISIS penalties against people that are seen to be dissidents or drifting away or whatever. And they're violent. They're violent against the SDF and other guards that are there. So, I mean, it seems to me that ISIS made a conscious decision to surrender in Magoo, because they know that the people that are fighting ISIS are not going to treat them like ISIS treated others. They're not just going to massacre them. They knew that the coalition will just relocate them, And I think they made a conscious decision to say, okay, we'll be relocated and we'll just regrow all of our networks once you've relocated us in the detention facility, which, by the way, if you follow the history of jihadism in the Middle East, you know that in many cases, jihadist networks thrive in prisons. So I think that it seems to be what's happening in Al-Hol and other places in Syria is a kind of huge, growing, emerging, looming problem, which is that you have tens of thousands, or at least thousands of hardcore supporters who are every day drinking the ISIS Kool-Aid and are not being de-radicalized. If anything, they got worse. And I don't think the international community, the coalition, or anyone has an idea of what to do on day 2, which is, okay, what happens after the SDF, or what's the plan? They're not going to go back to Europe. They can't go to Iraq. No one wants to hand them over to the Syrian regime. No one wants them to go to Turkey. And the SDF can't put them on trial. So are they just going to be there forever? And Al-Hol, by the way, is a lot bigger than Guantanamo. It's not like 50 people, right? So you have thousands of hardcore supporters with phones, with access to internet, probably. I think it's a huge problem in terms of who is exploiting who. I mean, I think that the hardcore supporters there are exploiting other children. So you have thousands of children there, some of whom are foreign, many of them are foreign. And no one seems to want to send the equivalent of child protective services in there to basically remove or isolate the children, which is actually what you would do, I think, with an extremist cult in some Western countries. You might actually do that. There aren't social workers that you would actually want to have the children working with those people. So isn't that just going to be another generation of extremists? I don't see how you prevent that. I see no evidence that that's being prevented. And I think that would be, it's a huge, huge problem. And the pandemic and the oil prices, it seems to me, only make it worse. And eventually we will see prison breaks, or we will see those women quietly being allowed to go somewhere else. I think that's the reality.
Can I just chip in here to what Seth was saying? I totally agree on the situation in that whole camp, but it's just interesting to see that the situation there is being transformed through cell phone photographs being put online from inside the camps, where women present, or if we now allow us to call them some Islamic State women, present themselves as victims, and it's then a very strong sort of a strong narrative when ISIS supporters or ISIS affiliates are being the one to be left to rescue them, because no one else cares about them. Child protection being one thing, basic human needs like having water, another thing that isn't being provided. So from inside the camp, these images and stories from these women were being sent out online through images or texts, is about that if anyone is going to save them, it's going to be Islamic State. And that's quite a powerful narrative when the international community isn't focusing on providing the basic needs in that camp currently.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Michael. So actually, Michael, the next question is for you as well, and it's from Pallavi Ade. Telegram has been the preferred channel of communication for terrorists. Could you highlight other channels, less obvious ones, that are being widely used by terrorists?
There's always an ethical dilemma in naming platforms, but I think it's widely known. Telegram has been and still is. I think we should not forget that Telegram still is a preferred platform, not just from Islamic State central media, but also their supporters. But as I said, in the last few months, there's always been a decentralization of use of platforms. And currently, I track around 20 platforms. I think the most active one that has a stable presence from both supporters and official outlets is something called Hoop Messenger Client. I think that's where they are currently exploiting the online environment and developing strategies. They also are on many other more well-known. Maybe Riot is a more well-known platform that they operate. That's also being heavily used by right-wing groups, so that's not specifically to Islamic State. But Hoop, they also experimented with TomTom, the Russian application, a few months ago a lot. But Hoop Messenger, I think, is the most stable one from what I can tell currently. But as I said, there are tens or maybe even hundreds of different minor encrypted platforms that they are experimenting on. But Telegram and Hoop is currently the main ones. And I just need to also add, I think Rocket Chat is also worth to mention. Rocket Chat they have used for several years, and that's a platform that they also are stable on.
Thank you, Michael. The next question is from Jack Morgan Jones to Seth. From what you've said, it seems the Islamic State does not have the sophistication it once had. How should this change a best case Western policy in the region? So would this, I mean, I presume that he means, would this change the fact that they no longer have the sophistication that they used to have? Does this change the outcome of Western policy in the region, or should it change it?
Well, I think it's very important to ask ourselves, you know, what exactly is the mission today, or what is the policy? I mean, there are something like 70 countries and partner forces in the coalition, right? But most of them don't seem to actually do that much. I think there are only several that carry out airstrikes. There were only a dozen or so doing training. So it's nice that people sign on to the global coalition. The global coalition is absolutely massive. It's more countries than have ever signed on to anything ever in history in terms of a coalition. But in terms of what is it actually, you know, what is the goal? I think that the goal seemed to be originally, you know, defeating ISIS on the ground. But that's fine. You can win the war tactically. But there wasn't a lot of follow-up strategy. There was no de-radicalization. There was no attempt, as far as I know, ever to find victims of ISIS, or not much attempt to find the victims of ISIS enslavement, the thousands of missing Yazidi women and children. There was very little attempt to do what the US originally called stabilization in Syria. I remember back in the day, they said they were going to fund all sorts of programs. And then once the US decided to withdraw from parts of Syria, they kind of threw that out the window. So it became just a military mission. So what, you know, I don't really understand what the global coalition is doing. I know that they put out statements where they say that, you know, they have air assets and they do surveillance and they share intelligence. I mean, that's great. You can share intelligence and you can do ISR or surveillance or whatever, but that just tells you that so-and-so who is a known terrorist went to a place and now we know he did that. But what does it mean on the ground? How do you fix Mosul? How do you rebuild Ramadi? How do you help the victims? How do you provide, you know, other avenues for this people? I don't see that, and that what I would say is the most important thing, which is, okay, ISIS is much weaker than it used to be, and the coalition looks much stronger, but in fact, the coalition isn't doing very much. So we have to decide, you know, what is the post-war concept? I mean, you know, I would think in general, if you win a war, like in 1945 or something, where you defeat some group like the Nazis, usually there's kind of a post-war something that happens. So what is the post-war concept? We've already seen 2 years of it, and it doesn't seem that there's much happening. And I think that one of the problems with the United States kind of global war on terrorist ethos is the United States is extremely good at finding and neutralizing or killing combatants or militants or terrorists. But the United States basically admits that it's not very good at doing the next step, which is Afghanistan or whatever, in which you stay for 20 years and then you just say, okay, well, now we'll sign a treaty with the Taliban, and okay, that was fun. So no one seems to have a follow-up, and I don't see any other members of the coalition, like the UK or France or anyone else, stepping forward to provide an answer to that. Which would lead me to say that maybe there should be a next meeting of the coalition. They should try to decide what they're doing. I think that there is also a lot of mission creep in Syria, where Pompeo and the Americans decided that their real mission in Syria was to get the Iranians also to leave, which the coalition then said, yeah, but wait, that's not our mission. We don't have a mandate to do that. So you put US soldiers at the front line, having to deal with an Iranian threat in which the actual mandate is not to deal with that, I think that leaves a lot of question marks. And I think many coalition partners, by the way, have withdrawn forces quietly, because claiming that due to the pandemic, under the guise of the fact that they're very concerned about the US-Iran tensions, and most of them are not on board with it. And I would say that we have to admit to the fact that the withdrawals or repositioning of forces, while it is supposedly because of the pandemic, is also linked to the Iran issue. And I think that we can't separate that out. And that means that a lot of the focus is off of ISIS, and no one seems to have an answer. I mean, on basic questions, for instance, why didn't European countries take back ISIS family members who are in places that we just mentioned in Syria? I mean, that would be kind of a simple thing to do, which is to repatriate your own citizens. And most countries don't want to do that. So that's a very simple thing. And we're not even talking about de-radicalization or social programs or stabilization or reconstruction or a kind of Marshall Plan type of thing. So I would say that leaves a lot of question marks. And if you wanted to say, well, yeah, what would be the best thing for the coalition to do? I think it needs to decide what its mission is. And I don't think that any of the countries involved in it actually want to do any of the follow-up work that would be necessary in this case, which leaves us at a problematic crossroads, which is what I wrote about in my book, and I continue to write about.
Thank you, Seth. History repeating itself, basically. Our next question is from Casper Shelfak, and I apologize for my terrible pronunciation. Casper asks, lacking access to medical services during the pandemic might create serious grievances among specific groups of people, residents of rural areas, refugees in refugee camps, etc. Michael, I'd like to ask you this question. Have you observed IS focusing its media efforts on these groups and these specific groups and their grievances?
I think there is a general interest among Islamic State supporters to present themselves as good-hearted, helping towards fellow Muslims, etc. Like but specific groups or specific local populations is hard, at least for me. I can't. I mean, there are tens of thousands of channels online, and I track around 200 every day. Like it's really a minor portion, but I can't really see that there are specific mentioning of certain groups. But there is an overall narrative about providing something that governments or regimes are not providing to populations. But those populations can be local and they can be international. So not specifically on what was asked here, sorry, but there is always, it's a familiar narrative, so to speak.
Great, thank you, Michael. So we have another question, and it's from Herbert Holzer. Do you think the European countries should take back the foreign fighters to prevent another rise of the Islamic State? Seth, you mentioned foreign ISIS fighters earlier. Do you think that one of the ways that we could, or they could prevent a proper resurgence, a strong resurgence, is by taking back Islamic State fighters, European Islamic State fighters, foreign Islamic State fighters?
It's not just about preventing a resurgence. I think it's about sending the right message, which is that if you join a group like ISIS and commit genocide, you need to face some sort of justice, even if in the end of the day the evidence is that you yourself were not involved, then fine, but you need to face it. You should face a trial at some point. And I think that at the very least, many of these people provided some support for terrorist groups, or they at least crossed borders illegally and should be prosecuted for entering Syria, Iraq illegally. I mean, it's kind of strange that these people were allowed to do this as if it was a kind of terrorist vacation. And then when the conflict is over, there was no there's nothing that happens. Like, usually in conflicts involving genocide or war crimes or crimes against humanity, whether it's, I think if you look at the Balkans, right, you usually have some sort of trials, or Nuremberg after 45. So there is a tradition of having trials. And I think that it's strange to me that in this example, all these countries would sign on to fight, but none of them want to take responsibility. And I think it's strange. How can you sign on to fight a war, but not want to deal with the combatants or the terrorists afterwards? Isn't that a key part of the conflict? So like, it's very strange. And I think one of the huge problems that no one ever asked was, okay, we're going to partner with forces on the ground that are not part of a recognized government. And therefore, we're going to set up a situation in which at the end, we have no way to process the detainees, which means we won't hand them over to the Syrian regime, which is ostensibly the recognized government. And yet we won't allow the SDF to prosecute them, and we won't repatriate them. So I would think that repatriation is absolutely essential, especially when the same countries claim that they don't want their citizens to go on trial in Syria, Iraq, because they don't trust the Syrian Iraqi judicial system, which is fine. You don't have to trust the local judicial system, but then you have to take them back. You can't just make them stateless, which some countries said, okay, we'll just pretend they don't exist, which I just think it's incredibly irresponsible. The wealthiest countries in the world, which are these European or United States countries, are involved in this campaign. And you're telling me that they cannot find a way to process these people, to keep them at The Hague or imprison them or do something with them, because secretly many of them know that they don't have enough evidence to prosecute some of them, and that they will have to release them back into the general population. And that's a serious problem, but then allow the local people there to prosecute them, or at least prosecute them for something like visa fraud or something. There must be something that you can do. And I think that it's incredibly irresponsible to wage a war and not want to deal with the aftermath of it, and just pretend that the concept is, well, we hope that they were able to kill them on a foreign battlefield, and otherwise we'll pretend they don't exist. And I understand that the reticence is because no one wants to admit that 10,000 ISIS fighters will basically go free. I understand the concerns, but then you need to find either an international solution or local solution to this. And I don't know if it fuels an ISIS resurgence, because I mean, some of the evidence is that when these people do return to their countries, they don't necessarily get back involved in extremism. So it's not that all of them will become extremists, but I would think that, and there were some cases locally where people were released to their tribes, in which there was a kind of agreement with the local tribe that, okay, you take him back and make sure he doesn't do anything bad. I don't know what the magic solution is, but I do think that it's irresponsible, and there is certainly a potential, as we've said before, when these people are sharing cell phones and pictures, that they recreate the network in the prison, and then they spread that out to their supporters online, which I think would be incredibly problematic. And again, you know, how come the richest countries in the world can't manage to get a hold of a cell phone network to jam the cell phone signals in Al-Khor? Are you kidding me? I mean, obviously you could. Everyone decided it's someone else's problem. Like, well, the United States says, well, we do this part of it, and the UK says we do that part. And when it comes to things like, well, why don't we try to do the smart part, which is like de-radicalization or jamming cell phones? People are like, no, we don't want to do that, which is, I think, and the pandemic only makes this, I think, even more impossible. You can't repatriate people now from Syria during a global pandemic. So that's just another silver bullet in the back of any way of solving any of this, which I think is that is a serious ramification of the COVID-19. Thank
you, Seth. So the next question is by Brony McDonald. Will the collapse of the Islamic State proto-state in Iraq and Syria weaken the hope and enthusiasm of Salafi jihadist revolutionaries in a similar way that the USSR collapse dampened the hopes of Muslim rebels fighting in various conflicts during the Cold War? So, bit of a historical turn here to look at what's happening now. I would ask you both to perhaps give your take on this one. Michael, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I would be happy to. I don't know if it was my internet connection or yours, but I couldn't really hear the question. Would you repeat it, please?
Sorry, yeah, I'll repeat it. It's probably my internet connection. It's quite bad in Tunis today. So the question is whether the collapse of the Islamic State, actual proto-state in Iraq and Syria, will weaken the hope of Salafi jihadist revolutionaries in a similar way that the USSR collapse dampened the hopes of Marxist-Leninist rebels fighting in various conflicts during the Cold War.
Okay. Thank you. I think it's very different contexts. I don't see the hopes based on a Salafi jihadist ideology would decrease in the sense as it happened after the USSR. But I think the Islamic State and the Caliphate project, I think what they have aimed to do is to not just keep a ideological support as much as they can, but also to increase it. And their main strategy for doing so was, especially after 2018, to transfer into a global movement of terrorism rather than this regional state project. And I believe, at least keep in mind, I'm a media researcher. I'm not on the ground in Iraq and Syria, so I wouldn't know for sure. But this transformation into a movement with different tactics than before, it is my impression that the support for, like, the ideological support has increased in the sense that on an international level, because of the tools available, the use of technologies, the inclusive approach to international supporters. But what that has meant for the local populations and the region itself, I'm really not an expert, and I have to admit that I don't feel comfortable talking about it because I wouldn't know. I think Seth would know more about this than me.
Seth, I'll let you take this as well then.
Look, I would say that I think he mentioned it as well. I mean, I don't think that ISIS is comparable to the Soviet Union or something like that, or they're not exact. I've always often compared the crimes of ISIS to the Nazis. I don't know the organization, the way in which it came about is exactly the same, because I think that, you know, ISIS was extremely lucky to arrive on the scene when it did, and it all of a sudden capture all this territory. And then, you know, it did, of course, use mass media at the exact right time when you could suddenly distribute everything openly. Remember back in the day before Twitter and YouTube were filtering this stuff. I remember in the summer of 2014 watching the videos in which people were being slaughtered at Camp Speicher. That would never be possible today on those platforms. They might be possible in other places. So, you know, ISIS just came into history at this weird, bizarre moment. And you can say, well, that's true. So did the Russian Revolution. So did the rise of the Nazis in 1933. Yeah, okay. But the problem is that, as we all know, the history of extremist jihadist types of movements is not exactly like that. And I think that I don't believe there is much evidence out there that the destruction of the quote-unquote caliphate or whatever has caused, for instance, groups like Al-Shabaab or Boko Haram to suddenly be like, well, it's all over. I mean, as far as I can tell, you know, that this caliphate or whatever was defeated. Maybe, you know, maybe they don't even think it was a caliphate. So they will continue fighting. And I think that the evidence shows that we have, if we look at the kind of multi-generational experience of radical extremism, jihadism, whatever, going back to the 80s, you know, we see these movements grow and fall in different places, whether it's, and we see them grow and fall for different reasons. Sometimes they're just local movements that have a global concept, but actually end up just being quite a localized movement. And maybe, for instance, Al-Shabaab or something like that. Sometimes we see that groups like Chechens, and they end up in ISIS by the thousands. And obviously that's because there was a wellspring of support in Chechnya. And yet, of course, if you listen to the Russian narrative or the Chechen leaders' narrative, that doesn't exist. Well, then how did all those people get there? So ISIS, of course, attracted people from places like Central Asia. They attracted people from China. I remember when I was on the front line in Tel Skuf, I used to ask the Peshmerga, what type of people are you facing today? And they said, most of them are Chinese. And I said, well, what do you mean Chinese? And they said, well, I don't know. They're from people from over there. So, you know, I guess we have to, we'll see what happens. I would tend to think that much like the Soviet Union was an ossifying edifice, and the Marxist groups that were on their places, actually, there were all these other types of Marxists, right? In Albania, or you had Tito, or you had the people in South America, you had Maoists and all these groups. By the way, some of these weird Marxist groups still exist, right? You still have rebels in parts of India that trace back to the Maoists or something. So like, yeah, there is some commonality with that idea. But I don't, I just think that in some ways, this type of radical religious extremism is a bit sui generis or whatever. So it's its own thing. And there is it's not entirely clear where it goes. I do think, from my experience, whereas the Middle East used to be the kind of center that was fueling extremist movements in other places, and I would say, for instance, you know, if we look at who were the 9/11 hijackers or whatever, or funding, I would say that today, the things have moved from the center to the periphery, which is that the people that joined ISIS, the 50,000 foreigners or 55,000 foreigners, they're people from the periphery, right? They're Europeans, Russians, Bangladesh. Actually, as I said before, the millions of people in Mosul only produced around 5,000 or 10,000 actual ISIS fighters, which is not very many. In the Battle of Berlin, I'm sure just the city itself, cost 500,000 casualties to take it in 1945? So the battle for Mosul was not the battle for Berlin. So I would say that what we see today is that most extremism, at least recruitment and numbers and people and inspiration, is taking place in places like sub-Saharan Africa. Imagine that, all the way down to Mozambique. We never thought that would happen. Or all the way out to the Philippines. Remember the fights with ISIS in the Philippines just 2 years ago? Or, you know, there is this problem in Europe, which is that you have generations of people that are, I think, have been radicalized, or are at least open to radicalization, including large numbers of converts. So the Middle East seems to kind of have I think it's dried up a bit in terms of its ability to produce generations of extremists. And that may be because the region is extremely tired from 20 years of war. And maybe people just don't have the energy to produce another generation of this. And they have hopefully turned the corner on that. But that means that you have to shift your focus then to these other weak states or unstable areas.
And that kind of leads us well into our next question from Yael Landman. Yael asks, as ISIS has lost power and Al-Qaeda is less present in attacks against EU and Western countries, what do you think is the next threat when you think of radical Islamism? I would like, Michael, if you would like to take this question.
I'm not entirely sure with what you mean with next threat. I mean, there is a development in which we have seen how, if we stick to Islamic State supporters and ideology, they have spread more, they have increased their operations on the African continent. We see it in many parts of Africa. I see troubling developments in many countries there. And I think the African continent will, for years, deal with this type of insurgency groups or militant Islamism that is presently sort of really intense on the continent. When it comes to Europe, I still believe that the Islamic State currently, their main purpose is not to try to rebuild the cell infrastructure in European countries. First of all, because they don't have the funding anymore, it's too expensive. But also secondly, because I think their primary interest is actually to establish and stabilize presence in Afghanistan, in India region. We see a large increase there as well, and on the African continent. So I think that the threat towards Europe, yeah, we still have these a lot of supporters who are willing to participate or conduct different attacks, but I still think that the major threat currently is in other parts of the world rather than Europe.
All right, so we're gonna wrap it up with one last question by Christopher Hockey. And Christopher is asking, so this question is also for Michael. He's asking, saying, Michael indicated that ISIS are portraying themselves as a viable alternative to respond to COVID-19. Realistically, what governance structure do ISIS have in place to practically respond to this pandemic? So are there doctors available? Are there medical facilities?
No, that's the simple truth. There isn't. And I haven't seen much evidence of any type of, at least not since the destruction of their actual state and administration. There are regions where they probably have possibilities, but that's, I mean, what is being told and amplified in their media operations is in this case very far from the truth. I would say credibility in terms of dealing with the coronavirus outbreak. For Islamic State, it's more of a existential dealing with it, when groups like Al-Qaeda, for instance, are more hands-on and have larger possibilities to show how they deal with it rather than the Islamic State. So I would say no. The claims that they do in this case is quite far from the truth.
All right. Guys, thank you very much for talking with us today. It was a very interesting panel. I think we could have probably, I mean, we could probably sit here and talk about this all day, to be honest. It's really a very fascinating topic. Thank you to the Eurogulf Information Center for hosting this panel. I think that there will probably be a report on this talk up online in the following days, and more online panels to come soon. So stay tuned. Do visit the Eurogulf Information Center website and Twitter account to know about the upcoming events. Again, Michael, Seth, thank you so much. Incredibly interesting talk, and be well. Thank you to our viewers for being here and for the questions that you sent over. And hope everyone is healthy and well. Thanks very much. Bye, guys.